Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, an avatar of the Eternal Reader, because we've been drawn in to the multiverse of Michael Moorcock. We must find the Eternal Champion, join in an adventure, and figure out where on earth to start. Because Michael Moorcock is one of the most prolific and, in my reading, most creative writers working in fantasy and science fiction across the second half of the 20th century. He created a dozen major characters, several of whom have like whole sequences of novels that they feature in. He worked in multiple subgenres of fantasy and science fiction. He helped create steampunk as we know it. He worked with eco-novels, new wave science fiction, sword and sorcery, historical fantasy, sort of bleeding into historical fiction. So he's created all these different types of science fiction and fantasy to appreciate. And then throughout those 50, roughly 50 works, he drew these different dots to connect the different worlds and works together and help readers realize that there's this eternal champion, that usually the protagonist of the work, who's featuring across this multiverse and that's generally doing battle against chaos to sort of rescue part of the multiverse. So where do we start? Well, for most readers, the answer is Elric. Elric is a fascinating character. He features in a whole series of novels. There's an early sequence of 6 books that I'll discuss, but then there are later Elric novels that Moorcock wrote. And these are quite effective. It's sword and sorcery, it's fantasy, it's sort of high fantasy, but there's a dark undercurrent. These were being written in the late 1950s, early 1960s, the early sequence. At a time when, of course, The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world is very popular and very very much appreciated by readers. And Moorcock sort of takes a different tone. We have these sort of different species, humanoid beings, one of which is Elric. He's a little different. We have magical weapons like Elric's magical sword, Stormbringer. We have dragons. Elric and his, the other members of his species are dragon riders. We have magical cities, with one of which can only be entered either by dragon or with this interesting like maze within the sea. And so there's all of those aspects of fantasy, but there's a very dark undercurrent. One simple example would be that Stormbringer, that magical sword I mentioned that Elric holds, well, it kills anything it touches. It's a magical sword that's super powerful, and it kills by stealing the soul of whatever creature or person it's taking the life of. That vitality within the sword then keeps Elric alive, because without it, he normally is using like special herbs in order to stay alive. So that dark undercurrent that's right there, that's just one example of how the sensibilities within the Elric books are a little different from the Lord of the Rings. But a lot of readers really appreciate these. One benefit to Moorcock's many, many works is that they're short. So you can read one of these in a weekend or even an afternoon. And if you enjoy it, you can go for more, or you can pick a different route. So the Elric books are a great entry point for many. Sometimes you can find them in the little silver paperbacks, or you might see them in these omnibus editions like the Borealis Legends ones that have a little number at the bottom telling which part of the series they are. They're collected in the Elric Song of the Black Sword and then Elric the Stealer of Souls. There's also a whole sequence that Del Rey published. I think there's like 6 of those, Duke Elric and others. These ones are kind of fun because they have cool maps of his lands. But these books are very popular. Now, Elric can be a little philosophical. He's very decadent. At times he can honestly be a bit of a whiner, but a lot of readers love him. Elric of Melniboné, the sailor of the seas, on the seas of fate. Probably my 2 favorites from the early sequence, Weird of the White Wolf and the Vanishing Tower. This sort of makes that concept of the eternal champion, the sort of war against chaos, a little more explicit. Now, Elric, curiously, is often sort of cutting deals with Ariok, a lord of chaos. Bane of the Black Sword, Stormbringer. And then that sort of closed out the early Elric sequence. There was a later one. We also have Elric at the End of Time. These are like short stories. And the Elric who's here, I think personally, is probably a big fan of The Cure in the 1980s. You could probably convince me that Robert Smith is an avatar of the Eternal Champion. But if the brooding Elric isn't heroic fantasy for you, then look no further than Hawkmoon. Not Hawkwind the band, even though Michael Moorcock did collaborate with them. Dorian Hawkmoon is the hero of the Runestaff sequence. This is number 3 on the Eternal Champion with the Borealis Legends. And he is a German duke, the Duke of Corum, who's going to war for freedom and trying to end the dangerous machinations of the evil empire that is Great Britain. And so Moorcock, writing in the late 1960s, is willing to interrogate, what's going on in the world and push for ideas that are much more about freedom, liberation, egalitarianism, and question colonialism at that time. So if you look closely, you can see a little black jewel here. That is the titular jewel in the skull of the first Runestaff book. Then there's the Mad God's Amulet, the Sword of the Dawn, and the Runestaff. These are pretty solid. They're much more like go get them. A lot of if you're more a fan of Conan the Barbarian and Elric's a little too philosophical, then this might be the perfect fit. Now, if you want a balance between those, some mythology and philosophy that's interesting, but a little more action, look no further than Corum. This is my personal favorite among Michael Moorcock's sort of high fantasy creations. We have Corum. This is a series that's influenced by sort of like Celtic and Welsh mythology. Corum is pretty clearly in Cornwall, in southwestern England, and he's kind of he's trapped between two different groups. There are the Lords of Chaos, who are awful and wreak havoc, and then there are the humans who are invading and overrunning his land and mutilate him at the very beginning, and he loses an eye and a hand, and he then is gifted sort of a superpowered eye and hand that function in a way like Stormbringer does with Elric, where they help him and keep him alive at critical junctures, but they also have a mind of their own. The hand, for example, he might try to pull back, and show mercy, and the hand will like kill his opponent. And then he has this question where he's interrogating again, what's going on? Like, this is my ally. I'm not alive without it, but also it does things I don't want it to do. But these books are quite interesting, and they have a nice balance of mythology, high fantasy, philosophy going on. These are sometimes known as the Swords trilogy: the Knight of the Swords, Queen of the Swords, King of the Swords. And Corum is pretty clearly like fighting against chaos in those. There's a later sequence with the bull and the spear, the oak and the ram, and the sword and the stallion. But I really enjoy these. Okay. Now, if you want to move out of fantasy, we're going to take a little tour over to steampunk, because Michael Moorcock helped sort of ignite the steampunk novels that were being published in the 70s and 80s in 1971 with his novel, The Warlord of the Air. And he did it in a different way from what we think of with both the original sort of science fiction of the late 19th century, and then later on the steampunk craze. So writers like Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and then more recently James P. Blaylock, K.W. Jeter, Tim Powers, Sherry Priest, where they are usually staying in the time period of the late 19th century, early 20th century. They maintain that sort of Victorian Edwardian technology and then maybe have a slight advance. What Moorcock did was he imagined that World War I didn't happen and nothing changes up through the 1970s. So he has a character, Oswald Bastable, a British soldier who goes into a cave in roughly 1900, and when he comes out, it's 1973. But the world's still basically the same. The European powers are still the European powers. They have powerful colonies and empires, really, that they are overlords of, and there are these airships going around that are massive zeppelins. And Bastable, kind of questioning, what he sees, even though he's very much what would have been a product of that in his own time. He ends up on an airship that's captained by someone that perceptive readers will realize is Joseph Conrad, the novelist, an old man. He ends up interacting with a Boy Scout troop leader who's Ronald Reagan. He meets up with a Lieutenant Michael Jagger, and he runs into a Russian exile living in Central Asia named Ulyanov. So there's all sorts of fun little historical Easter eggs across these books. Warlord of the Air is great. The ending is horrifying, but it is a great book. Land Leviathan is a little more hopeful. It has Africans creating tanks in the early 20th century and then deciding to throw off the yoke of empire. That one features Paul Robeson and Herbert Hoover. And then there's the Steel Tsar, about which I'll only say, who was the Russian man of steel? So if you enjoy steampunk, you enjoy sort of that side of history, this is probably the great starting point for the multiverse. And it's also a series of books that explicitly has una Persson. So the Eternal Champion often has a sidekick who changes across the different worlds and multiverse, just as the Eternal Champion does. And sometimes the sidekick from one and the Eternal Champion from another will meet up in a work, which is fun. But una Persson is another character who pops up not quite as a romantic interest for the Eternal Champion. Sometimes she is, but sometimes she's just there as a person, as this individual who's interacting with that world. Now we're going to head to a really strange corner of Michael Moorcock's multiverse, and that would be the Cornelius Chronicles, the works that feature Jared Cornelius. These are strange, they are unconventional. I have found readers who love the Bastable novels, who absolutely love Hawkmoon, who swear by Corum, a lot of readers who love Elric. I have yet to find somebody who says that the Jared Cornelius works are their favorites from the Michael Moorcock multiverse. Now, I enjoy them, but they're not my favorite. But I'd love to meet somebody who does love these. These are weird. They remind me quite a bit of the British television show The Prisoner. That weird sensibility, that fusion of sort of spy thriller, these investigations that are trying to be uncovered, these pop culture, fusion, but also something that's really strange. That's what we get here. The final program, A Cure for Cancer, The English Assassin, and The Condition of Music. I'll add the final program and English Assassin are definitely the strongest of these. Those were then followed by further adventures of Jared Cornelius, Chronicles Volumes 2 and 3. I don't know if I've ever met anybody who's also read these. Volumes 2 has The Lives, plural, and Times of Jared Cornelius, and the Entropy Tango. And then The Adventures of Una Persson and Catherine Cornelius in the 20th Century, and The Alchemist's Question. These are good. Another aspect of the multiverse is the Dancers at the End of Time. They are kind of strange, kind of weird. There's some philosophy in them. There's, comfort, poetry, beauty, appreciation of art. It's a little bit like the sensibilities of Elric without all of the violence from the sword. But the incarnation of the Eternal Champion here in An Alien Heat is Jarek Carnelian, not Jared Cornelius. I'll add that my wife one time had some questions for me when she saw me reading a book called An Alien Heat by Michael Moorcock. But moving out of those realms into Michael Moorcock's new wave science fiction he was working on really in the 1960s. He was editing science fiction works that feel a little bit closer to maybe what you might find in some of the stories that are anthologized in Dangerous Visions or Again Dangerous Visions. Works that are closer to what Samuel Delany was creating in his science fiction, or even Ursula K. Le Guin in some of her science fiction. We have The Roads Between Worlds Compendium, Volume 6, which has the fire clown on the front. Now, in this one, they're titled The Wrecks of Time, The Winds of Limbo, and The Shores of Death. By far the strongest is the middle one, The Winds of Limbo, which it was originally published as a novel called The Fire Clown. It's wild. It is really, really interesting. I did a video on it, which I'll link in the description box. But the Wrecks of Time actually has Dr. Falstaff, Faust and Falstaff combined. We have sort of questions around, corporate emergence going on, and the type of like corporate control, totalitarian corporations almost that we see in akin to works like The Space Merchants. But that work is interesting because it actually explicitly draws that Falstaff can kind of communicate with different worlds within the multiverse. The Fire Clown, though, is dynamite. That's a really, really good book. And here we start to get the influence of Michael Moorcock on music and music on Michael Moorcock. So that's a good one. More sort of new waves, sort of eco novels. We have the Sailing to Utopia volumes. Again, these are sort of more one-shots. They're interesting. They're a little weird. We have the Ice Schooner, the Black Corridor, the Distant Suns, and then the short story Flux. Some of these involve stars, interstellar travel. It's a little closer to science fiction for Moorcock than the more fantasy that he's probably more famous for. But I just managed to find this more recently. This can be a tough one to find. So if you see this and you're at all interested, maybe just pick it up. Because they can be tough to find. Now, both of those volumes in these publications, rather than the thin little paperbacks you'll find, the mass market paperbacks, they're stitched together with references to the Von Becks. The Von Becks are a family, not a single incarnation of the Eternal Champion the way that Jared Cornelius, Oswald Bastable, Corum, Hawkmoon, or Elric are, where it's the same character who keeps popping up. Here, rather, we have a family with different members who are the Eternal Champions. And these are much closer to historical fiction, historical fantasy. So the early one, The War Hound and The World's Pain, is set during the 30 Years' War. And rather than dealing with chaos, more explicitly, we have the Von Becks dealing with death, Grail concepts, and so you can see here, like the Von Beck from the Warhound and the World's Pain. The really good one is The City in the Autumn Stars. That one links up in the late 18th century with the French Revolution. That one's really, really good. This volume also has The Dragon and the Sword and The Pleasure Garden of Felipe Sagittarius, because Michael Moorcock can just be all over the place. One final one that can be really fun. Cane of Old Mars. These are set in the same type of world as the Edgar Rice Burroughs Old Mars books. Not really the Bradbury Martian Chronicles, but very much more of the Edgar Rice Burroughs Old Mars books. These are really fun. If that's your type of, you know, fantasy and science fiction, definitely give these a shot. This can be a tough volume to find. If you ever see it, just snag it. But the paperbacks are still around sometimes. City of the Beast, Lord of the Spiders, Masters of the Pit. Now, the one place I would recommend not starting with Michael Moorcock is his work, The Eternal Champion. It's an early work from Moorcock, the Borealis Legend version. It says #1, so it's tempting to pick it up. We have Eric Hose. He is drawn into it. He's drawn from Earth into a conflict where he seems to be on the side of the humans, basically trying to commit genocide against an alien race. He begins to question that and ultimately makes some decisions to fight against that. Against the human oppression. It's not his strongest work. It's a bit sophomoric at times, so I wouldn't recommend starting with The Eternal Champion. I think it can actually be a bit of a turnoff to read it as your first Michael Moorcock work. This one also has The Sundered World, Phoenix and Obsidian, and To Rescue Tainlorn, which is a little reference to Elric. So The Eternal Champion, I'd say wait till the end. There's also Mother London, which is an almost like postmodernist type, you know, maximalist work that you might enjoy if you enjoy Thomas Pynchon works. I think there's clear through lines between Michael Moorcock and like the early Doctor Who incarnations and even the 21st century ones. The sense of energy, you know, I mentioned The Prisoner with Jerry Cornelius, but I would say that the Cornelius works and some of the others. So I think there's a clear through line to Doctor Who as well. And so I really enjoy these works. I'd be curious to know if you've read any, if there's any that you really enjoy. I'm sure I'm going to get some Elric fans out there. But if you are somebody who enjoys one of these ones, please let me know. I'd love to talk about these with more readers. And if you end up reading Michael Moorcock from this, please let me know. Let me know what you think. All the best. Thanks.